Hello, fellow engineers, and welcome back to the 2025 Q1 competition for chemical science. This is episode 2, which is the playoff round. In the last episode, we left you off with all the designs that performed under the baseline, and we said goodbye to those, and we covered those in depth. Today's is going to go through all of these lovely designs that we have here, all of these 20 designs that performed above the baseline. And we're going to try to kind of get an understanding of what works, what didn't work, what is better, and see if we can find common patterns to them. So I want to talk through how I'm going to approach this video. One of the problems is there's so many differences in terms of number of foundries, whether something is using an RS latch or has to control basic oil processing, or if it's just constantly active, for example, here, right? So, like, what do I mean by that? So a lot of these designs will wind up having a buffer tank, and they turn on and off these only when there is an overflow of storage tanks. Then there's so many, basically just inserters that are all over the place. There's different quality levels of inserters. There's a mixture of them, and then there's different tactics. So some of these designs are using direct insertion. A lot of them are using direct insertion from an assembly machine making engines going directly into a chemical science machine, right? So, and then there's also designs that are using recipe switching, like this design here, that is all alternating between these different ones, right? And we have the same thing. We have even more recipe switching designs. We have ones that are using absolutely no clocking at all and are just picking up items from a belt. And then we have builds that are really complicated and use a lot of decider combinators and wires that go all over the place. And so where I'm getting with this is, like, there's so many designs that have completely different tactics on how they control something. And the main decision factors at the end of the day are you doing direct insertion into assembly machines? Are you doing recipe switching into chassis to go into an assembly machine making engine units? And I think the biggest differentiator across all these designs that we'll get into is, like, how are you making the red circuits? And so this is overwhelming because of the complexity that exists in how each of these designs have approached it from a wildly different perspective, all have different amounts of signs that they're creating and totally different tactics on how they're producing at the end, like the number of basically the signs that they're doing it. So I said, hold on. Me sitting here, talking through each design, going and pulling up in VS Code, cool, here's all the wonderful time series data that I've got, and going and comparing them, kind of creating a cross-network analysis, what's going on across all these different designs, what are the wave characteristics. Probably useful, but we'll be here 3 hours talking about that. There's got to be a better way to holistically compare these designs and get us a good starting point, where we can say what actually mattered for this, without me having to go through and explain and guess on each design what those are. So I have a solution for that, and I had to teach myself a little bit about statistics this week, but hopefully this will be helpful. Before we get into that, what is this competition if you're not familiar with it? So what we're doing is we're going to be going through all the different designs that we have. There was a lot of submissions. We talked about this in the last video. There's over 36 designs that actually were submitted. A lot of them got disqualified and failed the tests in the beginning. And then right now, what I've done is I've created a benchmark file for every single one of the designs, and they all use the standard template for basically producing all the materials, unless they wound up going and using a different tactic and deviated from it, and then I created it. This took a lot of effort and time, but we've got to a good point. We covered a lot of the different designs that performed worse than the baseline, and I have this nice report. You can go and look at my GitHub if you missed it, or highly encourage you, go back to the other video and go watch it. So out of the designs that we're testing today, these are the top 20 basically designs that performed above the baseline. So there's 21 total designs that we're testing. I've created a separate, basically round 2, and these are all the results that I'm gonna be talking about. You'll see these on my GitHub page. I have time series data, the run distributions, all that good stuff. However, the main difference is the first round that we did was run for 18,000 ticks. And so the second round, what we're going to be doing is we're going to go and increase this. We're going to jump up to 36,000 ticks, and we're going to run, instead of 5 runs, we're going to do 10. So hopefully what this is going to do is we're going to get to a point where we have a lower variance and we have a better average across all the designs. Will this impact their placement compared to the last time? Well, you have to wait and see. But that's kind of the question is, are these designs going to change? Now, I'll tell you right away, the baseline's not going to become the first place. What you're most likely going to see is, as we look at the results, is that you're going to see two designs swap places, because they're very close. So these two designs, like 29 by Geist and Reja, they're very close in terms of their original characteristics. They might swap places. Now, introducing more ticks, you might see that they have a very expensive operation that happens once in a while, because a lot of the designs are using those RS latches that I talked about. They might swap places because of that too, or they might drop down multiple places. So that'll probably happen. Let's talk about now how I'm going to approach, and how I approach this week, trying to find a way to deal with the complexity of 21 unique designs and different strategies, and trying to compare them without losing what's left of my hair. So fair warning, this next section is not even related to Factorio. I mean, it's kind of, but it's basically just me trying to be a data scientist for a little bit. I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a statistician. I know very little about it. I'm just a programmer, and I did some math to try to understand kind of how to do some cool statistics stuff. So if you are a statistician or you are a data scientist, I apologize for the hacky nature of what you're going to see. But with that disclaimer being said, what I did was I said, okay, we have all these wonderful designs. I have all their blueprints captured. So I know that I can, because I've done this in the past, I've extracted information from a blueprint. So what does that mean? Well, for those who are unfamiliar, let's say I grab, a blueprint that exists out here. Let's grab, a random one that exists here. Let's grab this one here. And let me go back over to Factorio. So I copied that, and I go and I import, a blueprint string. Everyone's familiar with this, right? You can import a blueprint. That's what basically shows up. And then you have now all the entity data. So how does that come about? So all the entity data is stored directly as a JSON file, which you can extract. So when you convert it, that's what's here. You can see the description of it. You can see also all the wonderful entities. Where is a turbo transport belt? I can look at stack inserters. So if I type in stack inserter, I can see where its position is relatively. I can see the direction, which direction it's facing. I can see what the control circuits are, which here you can see that it's setting the filters. So you get a whole bunch of information. So what I first said was like, cool, let me just grab this and just get a straight count of all of them, right? That would be an easy thing to do. So first I created a script that basically goes and takes all the blueprint files, converts them to JSON. So that's basically those files that you saw here. The next thing that I did is I created a cool entity counter. So what it basically does is it goes through all the JSON files that were created, and then it creates an entity count for every single one of the designs, so which is shown here. So what's cool is that it basically goes and says, okay, how many assembly machine 3s do you have? We have 76 of them in this design. But then I said, well, we can do a little bit better than that, because I can see if, what the recipe is of that particular machine. So I said, all right, let me go and grab it and then append. Additionally, let me count what the total number of that entity type is. But let me also count the number that happen to be creating chemical science pack versus engine units. Those are the two that are in this design, right? So let me do that. So then the sum of these two is 76. So that adds up. That makes sense. So now I can basically have a count of how many chemical science packs to engine units are there. That's a kind of an interesting ratio. Also, I can get how many beacons do we have? But then after talking a little bit in Discord, I said, hey, what other statistics would you like to cross-reference across all these different designs? And immediately someone wound up saying, hey, it'd be really cool if I could see how many direct insertion inserters there are. And I said, oof. Well, that's a lot harder, right? And I'll tell you what, I am not going to go through and count every single one of these inserters that are in here. That is a no-go. There is no way I'm going to be doing that. That's going to take way too long to go and do that. So, but then I thought about it a little bit and I said, well, technically, the position data is recorded. And technically, I know the position of this entity. And technically, I know the position of this entity. So, if I know the position of the assembly machine here, and I know the position of this assembly machine, I know this is 3 tiles wide and 3 tiles tall, and I know where this particular inserter is, I can kind of, I basically can say, okay, which direction is the inserter facing? Where is its input square? Where is its output square? And is there an intersection? Basically, does it happen to collide with that machine? And I said, all right, we can probably brute force that. So I wound up going in and create a script to do exactly that. And I wound up basically creating this wonderful entity counter. And sorry for those that are JavaScript haters. Here's the thing I'll say about JavaScript. It's quick and dirty, gets the job done, and it is easy to write once and never maintain again. So it's great for just quick when you need to do something and you don't care about ever using it again. So yeah, so I wound up creating something that classifies inserters. So it turns out you can figure out kind of the direction that they're going. You can create a vector and say which direction the inserter is actually pointing. You can create like where is its target position and where's its pickup position and its drop position. And then I wound up basically going and saying, okay, well, let me classify the tile size of all the buildings I care about, all the chests. Yes, cargo wagons are included in chests, and all the belts that I have, and basically what their sizes are. So then I basically just like took all of those, and then I wound up just going and yeah, I classified all of those different things. And so this is code, this is cool, basically this is what it's doing. All right, great, now I have labels for all of them. What does that mean? Well, now if I go to stack inserters, oh boy, I've got a lot of classifications. I know A, how many stack inserters are in the build in total. I know how many stack inserters are controlled on and off with a circuit. How many of them are doing direct insertion? So you can see this build is heavily favoring picking up items from a belt. You can see then also how many of the direct insertion inserters are controlled by a circuit. I can know how many stack inserters are going and dropping an item or like picking something from an assembly machine, creating chemical science packs. Know how many are going from a chemical science to a turbo transport belt. So basically what this does is it takes every single stack inserter, knows if it happens to be circuit controlled, and also from which building to which building it's going. So what that means is now we know every single stack inserter and what they're doing and how many counts they have in general across the entirety of all 36 designs. So why did I do this? So let's talk a little bit about statistics. So if you take all those designs and you take all those metrics and you go and compute them and cross-reference them against the whole update time, control behavior, and transport line times, you might be able to try to find a pattern. So you take a needle out of a haystack of all of those potential different metrics that we've generated here. You get to a point where you could actually go and find some cool patterns. So for example, the first one that jumped out as I was just initially looking at it was I said, okay, and I'm sorry if you're red-green colorblind, this is probably not going to be all that helpful, but I created this heat map to kind of give an idea per column, like what is high and what's low for that. So I was like, okay, let me look at metric fluid flow update. So this one's really high, right? So it has a very high basically like fluid flow update. Well, why is that? Well, I cross-referenced that, saw that it has the highest number of, let's go to the foundries. Well, okay, it seems like it had the most foundries total counts, right? So, and there also seemed to be a relationship of how many happen to be casting copper plates seemed to impact it. And also the number, but like in general, the biggest correlation was the more foundries you wind up having, the higher your overall fluid flow update is going to be in general. So I said, okay, so it seems like there happens to be a correlation between foundries and your fluid flow update time. But I said, okay, well, I can keep finding needles in a haystack, but there's got to be a way for me to already predetermine which of these statistics actually impact the overall metric that I care about. Well, turns out there is. I didn't know this, so I'm going to teach this to you because I learned about it this week. So statisticians in the room probably are all going to know what the Pearson correlation coefficient is, right? It's a bunch of math. It's cool. This is all really cool stuff that I did in college and I never want to think about again, but there's lots of cool equations here. What is the short summary? What does the equation do? It basically says, okay, if you have a perfect relationship, then you're going to have a relationship where all the different data points that you care about perfectly line up exactly linearly on a graph like this. So that means it's a perfect positive correlation. That means that as you increase one thing, it increases the other. So in our case, as the more foundries you have, the more your fluid flow update time goes up. Vice versa, if it was the other way around, if you added some more of that thing, then it would decrease the other statistic. So those were relationships. So I'm looking for basically anything that indicates there is a direct correlation. So if you have a strong positive correlation, it means that you have a big distribution like this and still indicates a positive, basically, trend. But that means that it's not an immediate, like it's not a 100% certainty, but it's still pretty strong. Like you can still see that there's a trend here, right? Low is like, all right, it's kind of going in that direction, but there's outliers where this isn't always the case, basically. And then finally, there's no correlation. That means that these two metrics are not related. So what I care about is basically anything that has a strong, and I basically am saying that a strong relationship for me is not greater than 5, it's greater than 7. So that means I need a really tight distribution, and that's what I cared about. So, wrote some more code. I wrote code to basically take all of these different columns that you're seeing here and compare them against all of the metrics that we care about. So we saw in the last episode that if you're using cargo wagons, you wind up seeing a larger update time in trains. So we saw that here. So Lady Manus is using cargo wagons as a chest. So we saw a train update time that was being attributed to that. So if I wrote all the code and everything right, that would mean that I should see that for the designs, so for Lady Manus design here, and Jobo's design that is using trains, and McMahon's, Dantrix, Mayhem down here, all of them that are using them all for like red circuits to craft them, I should see that there is a almost 100% correlation with train network update time going up the moment that you introduce a cargo wagon. So let's see if the code that I wrote actually goes and generates that result. So sorry again for the white screen that you're seeing here, but this is what I've got right now to work with. So I copied basically the results of that and plugged them in here, and oh wow, we actually do have a lot of things that basically have a high negative impact or high positive impact, and the ones that I care about are the ones that are more in high region and this region over here. So yeah, look at that. Right away, you add cargo wagons, it's basically a one-to-one relationship with your train network update time going up, or your train update time going up. Makes sense, right? So okay, seems like it works. So but I don't care about that. Like, I know that that's true. We could see that just in the basic results. That tells us nothing. So what do I do care about is this. So let's go and grab all the other items that we have now, because we plotted all those wonderful things. And let's go and let's remove the moderate and the low impacts, and we'll just focus on the high range. So the ones that all of a sudden stood out to me, and if you look at like the strengths, Z to A, you see that like my observation made sense with my eye. I could wind up seeing that foundries and pipes to the ground. Well, what does that mean? Pipe to ground is the blueprint equivalent name for an underground pipe. We call it underground pipes, but that's the name of it. It seemed like fluid flow update time would go up as you had more pipes to the ground, and you also fluid flow update would go up when you had a lot more foundries. Well, that makes sense because we saw that. But why are underground pipes there? Well, gotta kind of understand that, like, yes, that is true in general. The more underground pipes you have, the higher your fluid flow update time. But it's really because, in general, the more foundries you have, the more likely you're to have more underground pipes to connect to all of said foundries. So it's so the correlation is higher because what you actually wind up seeing is if we look at just the fluid flow update time, what are the things that impact it that have a high relationship? Well, it's every single item that's connected to it. Cryogenic plants, foundries casting steel, foundry, stack base, and then there would be non-direct relationships, and this is why it's important to kind of like think about these things in the context of the designs. You would see that, okay, the more stack inserters that are dropping things basically to a cryogenic plant, they wind up having a higher update time. Well, it's not the stack inserter's fault. It's just because you happen to have more cryogenic plants. That's really the relationship. And so this makes sense because here you see kind of a higher relationship of foundries casting iron gear wheels, but really the one that's higher is just the raw foundry category, the raw cryogenic plant. And then overall, it's all combined with the more underground pipes you have to connect those two said buildings, the higher your fluid flow update time is. So this basically means that I'm very confident that the equations and everything that I wrote are making sense because we're getting what we would expect. Now, something that I guess intuitively makes sense, but I didn't think about it until basically recording this video, is that, like, yeah, the number of items that you happen to have connected to a fluid network, the higher your fluid flow update time is going to be. And that also makes sense because when I ran these benchmarks, the items that had maximalist direction insertion, so this design specifically, had the highest fluid flow update time. And that's because it happened to have the most foundries all using maximalist direct insertion, and there's just so many entities that are all connected to this fluid pipeline. What's kind of cool is, what that made me realize is you can actually think about your fluids as a network, just like an electric network or a circuit network. The more entities you have connected to it, the higher that particular stat will go. So anyway, so that made sense. So now I'm like, okay, great. Now I have a really good way for us to, at a high level, without even going into the analysis of all the designs and listening to me ramble, we have a good way to look at each metric and determine what had a direct relationship, and are actually rather impacted that specific metric the most. So let's go through those and let's talk about them. So the one that I care the most about is going to be our entity update time, because entity update time is the one that has the largest magnitude in terms of its value. So there's two properties that jumped out, and the only two things that attribute to entity update time. It wasn't counts of buildings, it wasn't counts of beacons, it was none of that. None of those things had any high correlation. If you look at all of them that are here, you see there's a lot. There's a lot of things that seem to be kind of correlated. So if I look at basically the strength and I do this, the only two that stood out was the stack inserters to belts and which means stack inserters that are dropping something to a belt. The other one was output inserters, so that are basically their enable gate. What is that property? So I could have probably extracted this with a script, but what I wound up doing is I went through each design and I looked at what is their circuit network condition for when they pull something out of a belt. And so we saw that with some of the better designs, they wind up having this value, which is greater than or equal to 16. And some of the worst designs, or a lot of them actually, wound up using a control condition where the enable condition is greater than 7. So how does this impact the system? Well, what this does is that instead of grabbing and swinging once, they pick up halfway through. So they pick them up at the 8 mark, and then they pick them up again and drop them at when they get to 16. So basically active twice the amount of time. So what does this statistic actually show us after I wrote those all down and cross-reference them against entity update time? Well, this shows a decrease of that. Well, so what does that mean? So that means that the higher the condition, if it's greater than 8 or greater than 16, if it was swinging less, your entity update time went down. So that condition that's on the decider combinator, if it was a higher value and it was at 16, it decreased and had a direct or a high relationship between total entity update time. Some of these other statistics here that you can look at are kind of have like a moderate impact, right? So if we start looking at those in general, you see that there's a storage tank that has kind of an impact. So why do storage tanks matter? Well, storage tanks are something that is being used that indicates actually something else that's going on. Storage tanks are something that are being used to basically throttle your the buildings that are going and producing petroleum. So some buildings have them just running all the time. And you can see here too, if I look at the active time, this is constantly active. Whereas the ones that are over here, that are, let's say we find a design that actually does this. So over here, what this does is this throttles via condition that it will only enable when it is greater than basically like this here. It triggered it on. It was less than 5,000. It's active. It's going to continue to produce it until this fluid gets to 20K. And once it gets to 20K, it will stop. So for designs that, like this one's not the best example, there's designs here that have a huge increase, like have an over ratio of the items that they have double the amount. These are only active for a very short period of time. You can see that here. So if we increase the game speed, let's go to 4, you can see that this is now active and stops. And then it drops below, becomes active, and it stops again. So this simple circuit is really nice because it decreases your entity update time, but it has kind of a moderate impact. So it seems like this has an impact, but it's not a huge impact to the entity update time, but it matters a little bit, right? We're seeing that there is a relationship, not huge, but a relationship that exists. And so that kind of continues to go on with some of the items that kind of make sense. Like in general, stack inserters from a cryogenic plant that is producing plastic bars going to a turbo transport belt, that had a moderate impact to the entity update time, so that went up. So if you started to transport plastic on a transport belt, that had an entity update time that impacted it. So there's also another one, which is here, the stack inserters going from a turbo transport belt to an electromagnetic plant making electronic circuits. That also had an impact to it. That also makes sense because in the baseline design that I have, I very purposefully chose that the baseline was going to be designed that it would actually transport, like basically the materials itself via belt. So that had a basically an impact, not huge, but an impact to the entity update time as well. Well, it's mainly because these inserters are active so often now. Let me go back to the regular game speed here. So what we're kind of finding with this is there's specific things that impacted it more or less to help or to decrease it based on these different facts. So what I want to focus on for us is, like, there's certain things that just have no real correlation. This is why I am not going to focus on the moderate ones, because it will tend to find greedily things based on like space platform update time. There is like the value of space platform is basically 0 or 1 in its noise, so it'll think that there's an indication, but there isn't. So these values, these like moderate kind of like correlations, are not that interesting to me. What is interesting to me is the ones that are high or above. So we're going to focus on that, but I just want to call it out that it can find other things that will impact it. To kind of demonstrate now what I mean by that is if we look at the entity update time, you can see here I have this sorted from the best entity update time all the way to the highest, right? And what you can see here is there is a very clear pattern on the right-hand side. So depending on that condition that was set, if the inserters are always picking up items when the assembly machine has 16 in them, you can see how the entity update time is really consistent across all of these. And so these designs in particular, these basically, if you look at the count here, right? There's 9 designs that did this. Now they all didn't on average have a whole update time that basically goes in the same direction, but their entity update time was directly related to it. Now you can see here, some of them have 8, some of them have no conditions set at all. So that means that they have no like basically inserter like on-off control. But you can see just like as you get worse, sure, this is an outlier, but this still just means like because the stack size is 16, you're still double swinging. So this made no impact. So it was like, so anything that was doing half swings or double swings had a higher entity update time in general. So that correlation makes sense because we saw that correlation was high, right? And so how does it determine that? Well, when we look at the entity update time over here compared to basically the number of stack inserters that are dropping to a belt, you can see that there is a relationship that is pretty close and tight, and like it actually kind of like shows that there is an entity update time that kind of goes up. Same thing is that as you drop, basically as your condition winds up getting higher, so you're swinging less often, your entity update time starts to drop. So stack inserters were the only thing out of everything here that had a direct relationship between them. So how does this play out in the actual results? So in the actual results, when I reran these now, you can see that basically the order is very similar to the last episode. There's some slight differences. So we have, let's compare them now side by side. So I'm going to keep this one and I'll put it on the right. And then I'm going to pull up the ones from the round 1 qualifiers. And let's grab all those that were above the baseline. I'll move this to the left. The left right now are all of the basic designs and how they did the first time, 18,000 ticks. This is 36,000 ticks. What I find interesting is that now that we've run these and we ran these for 5 runs and this is 10 runs, you can see just how tight and how close these top 3 designs are. I'll touch on this a little bit later and I'll talk about this more in the finals, but I find it how interesting these 3 top designs are. So the next thing that I kind of want to point out is you're going to see some things that wind up swapping in place that exists here. So we have, like, for example, these top 5, 6, 7 designs all wound up being basically the same. There was no real difference. The main thing that you wind up seeing is some that, like, where these 2 designs were very close. So one from Undertow and from Phlap, these 2 designs were very similar. And so therefore they just swapped on a longer run. So they're very close. So that kind of, and you see that kind of across the board. So you can see like Ozboz and the Flying Curryfish's designs having kind of like a swap that kind of happens. And you see the same thing then just in a couple other places where like Raja's and Geist's 29 design wound up swapping places because they were close. And you see the same thing happen with my design and Phlap's design up here on the top, is that they wound up just swapping places. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other, right? It just means that, okay, like on a longer run, one happened to win out a little bit more than another. And so that's why in the finals, I'll run it for much longer. So for a full hour, and we'll do 10 runs for the top 5 designs, or I probably will include the top 7 now that I'm thinking about it because of just how close these all are. I'm curious to see how they perform on a longer term. So those are kind of like the things that I'm seeing. And so now that we have this here, let's talk about the ones and what they did well. So we just saw that the designs, if we sort these basically in order of whole update time. Again, before we even get into Factorial, I want to just do this everything here first, just based on the statistics here. So we sort everything by whole update time. So we have now the whole update time here. You can see that this is not a direct relationship with entity update time. And that makes sense because we see that over here too, that there's an outlier that exists immediately, which is Undertow's design. That it wound up basically having a higher entity update time, but it performed better than the version here by Phlap because of just how much lower of a control behavior update time it had. And so the overall statistics, it wound up doing better even though its entity update time was higher. So it's not always a direct relationship between those things because you're balancing all this stuff, right? So, but what were the things that we saw as a pattern that emerged from this that actually does count? So we saw those stack inserters and their control decisions. So let's go and look at that enable gate again. If we look at this basically here, and we look at the worst design to the best design. Actually, let's flip that on its head. And do this here. For the best design here, you can see that the top designs here are all using stack 16, except for Undertow's. Well, Undertow didn't do any control logic at all. He just basically just had the inserters just use wake lists. So that's what's kind of fascinating is that here, all the ones that are in the top slot are either using, are always picking up constantly, or they are using and only swinging once and are clocked. So that's immediately something that just separates it from the rest of the pack. So that's something that we saw. And that's the case. So let's go over to Factorial. Let's go and prove that that's actually 100% what's going on. So if we look at here, if we look at basically this design here, this design, right? Here's that condition greater than or equal to 8. You see the same thing as you go kind of up. We'll just go up like a random sample size up here. If you look at this design, this one's also using, greater than or equal to 8. It's not until you get all the way to the top, basically like starts the end of the top 7, where you start seeing it. And some of these designs are a little bit chaotic. Let me find one that's like where I actually know where it's at. So here. See, all of these are always enabling it when it's greater than or equal to 16. So that immediately is something that stood out to me. I can see that that's an impact. That is a common pattern that happened across all of them. The next pattern that I want to starting to notice is that, okay, well, cool. So we know that like the stack inserters happen to be higher. Like, so just if you happen to be using that condition, that matters. But are we sure it's those particular stack inserters? Because we've compared both of those, compared the condition and the stack inserters that are dropping items. Is that really the thing that's making more of a difference? Well, let's go back and let's look at the secondary metrics. Just look at all stack inserters, right? So let's look at just any property that happened to relate to stack inserters. So the ones that had the highest correlation here, if we look at the one that jumps out immediately here that's interesting, is that if we sort this by basically the strength, basically Z to A, and then only filter for stack inserters, the number one that impacts control behavior update time that had direct, at least of high correlation, was specifically the stack inserters pulling from the chemical science pack assembly machines that happen to be on and off circuit enabled. Those had the highest correlation for control behavior update time. Second one was just any of the stack inserters that happen to be turned on or turned off by a condition that impacted the control behavior update time. The other part that I found was interesting is that you saw electric network update time kind of go up if you had more stack inserters going to a building. So that doesn't matter, because really if you isolate the electric network, the thing that actually has the main correlation is just you happen to have more stack inserters. And stack inserters going to a building is going to impact the electric network update time more, not because of it going to a building, it's because of direct insertion. You just happen to have more stack inserters in a direct insertion build, so your electric network update time goes up as well from that. So out of the things that mattered, like control behavior update time does matter for these designs, right? Because we do wind up seeing a large fluctuation in the different control methods and control behavior update times. And that actually accounts for a large portion of some of these designs, right? It's a non-insignificant amount. Like transport line update time, sure, there is an amount there, but it's not as big of a deal. The control behavior update time hurts a lot of the designs, especially for design 11 from the flying curryfish. So if we look at specifically that design, the question that will kind of come up is, okay, how many stack inserters in general, like the one that actually impacts the control behavior update time the most, right? Let's just look at how many happen to be circuit enabled. So let's go back over to the raw statistics, and let's go find that one. So over here, if we find that particular one, the one that has the highest here is this guy. Yeah, that's the flying curryfish. So yeah, 1-to-1, that makes sense. Let's go look at that design. Let's see why it actually happened to have such a high control update time. So if we go now to Factorio and let's look at that design, that is this build that is all the way down here. It's this giant one. And so this is actually pretty cool because it actually proves out the exact aggregate statistic that we looked at. Look at all these inserters over here. You see how they're all relying on their wake lists? Well, the reason they are is because this is way overbuilt. What's happening here is if you look at, this is creating 240 per second here, right? So this is a 960 per second build. If we look at the number of assembly machines that are here, and we just look at their output rate, this can make 396.2 per second. So this is way overkill. So that means that half of this build, or this top portion here, is just occasionally filling in the belt gaps. So really the machines that are always constantly active are just these here. These make 240 per second, just this small section. But this extra section that's on the top here is making 154 extra per second. Now, I don't know why. I haven't talked to the designer of what the reasoning for that was. But what is happening is you can see how all these entities are here connected to the circuit network. And it's constantly getting a little quick check, on off, it needs to do something. But it can't, right? It's technically disabled. And if we go and I type in the F5 menu, we go into the debug settings, you can see something that's interesting here on the bottom right-hand corner. You can see how the wake-up list count is kind of fluctuating on the right-hand side, even though you're not really seeing it. But we see it here with this yellow indicator that its wake list is kind of getting triggered. It seems like the expensive part is the fact that it's constantly trying to drop to a belt. and it's trying to keep on moving, but it can't because it'll never get there because the other machines are doing their job all the time. So this makes sense that your control network update time is so much higher on this specific design because of that. Let's go look at the time series data a little bit of this design and dive a little bit deeper into it. So for this, I just plotted basically 18,000 ticks so that we can see all the different designs themselves. So if we look at this, you can see that there is a constant kind of control network update time that's just elevated compared to some of the highest performing design, which is Lady Manus, so just a higher one. I'm going to go and generate now a smaller portion so we can look at just a 240 tick range. And so if you look at this, like basically now that I've generated the 240 tick chart with my script here, we can see basically that when this is happening, there is a control entity update time that kind of gets activated here. But there's a lot of these other little extra micro like updates that are happening all the time. And so if you look at like another design for comparison, so let's go over here to this one, you can see that it's a lot more like fixed. So there's like a small spike, and then there's a large spike here when they actually are dropping the signs. And we know this is kind of the cadence of like a 16 tick update rate, right? So because this one is it's suffering two things, this particular design, the moment that you start looking into it more. The enable is like the biggest cadence that proves it. But you can see kind of like here, this spread of from this tick to this tick when this happens. And if we look at the other one here, the number of ticks that are separating is happening much more frequently. And if you look into it further into this design, what you'll notice is it does some of the things that kind of became an issue originally for some of them that didn't perform above the baseline. And as if you look at the circuit network, there's a lot more signals that are going across it. So even though we are getting all kinds of different values, we're not always getting like basically the chemical science build. But you're seeing it has to make a check for when these other values are coming across. And those are those micro, like small, like basically things that it's doing. So the large ones are when it's actually checking its own condition and is activating. But the small ones is all the other inserters just kind of going like, okay, do I need to do something? Do I need to do something? Do I need to do something? Etc. That's why, like, again, just guarding the signals that are going across and not having one large network works and is better. But in general, that's where we can see that like the number of inserters that are activated from an on-off, because all of them are on this same network that is over here, they all have the same enable condition. So all of these here are on the same network, all on-off, and it has the highest number of inserters that happen to have that. And so it had the largest impact because it's also plagued by the circuit network not being guarded. I don't have a statistic for that, but like that also kind of shows it. So the number of inserters that are even cool to show like the entity, like the network, but the blueprint doesn't tell you that immediately. So that is kind of where you're seeing that the effect of when you happen to have that those were the most expensive ones, that the number of stack inserters going to assembly machine that happen to be circuit enabled, that's the most expensive part of this whole build, is the inserters interacting with the assembly machines. Because that's like, it makes sense, right? Because that's where everything happens. That's where, sure, you can have a lot of processing going on over here. There's a lot of things that are happening, but it seems like the biggest impact to entities are what are you doing with each of these assembly machines and how you do that. And you can see as a general trend, here we have noisy signals on these inserters. Here there's just a lot more inserters because we just have more assembly machines. So then that's also more that are just connected. Again, having basically different check marks, so that's a common pattern. So, and then you can see here for this particular design, again, we have, this one's nicely guarded, which is good. So, but there are now just, again, here, if we look at the number of assembly machines here, this is 13, so this is more. So the more that are there, the higher your control network update time is. And then like the designs like here, again, this is like basically, this is 12. And the best designs that were performing the best all have 11 assembly machines. So less overall inserters interacting with this entity time went down. The overall like thing that I immediately noticed with this is that all the designs that do better than others are the ones that have less overall entities in general. Second thing is they don't have too many entities that are here on the end that are still being sent a control signal. So here's a really good example of an inserter that doesn't have the overhead of an extra basically signal going across it. when it doesn't need it. So this is a good example of lower control network update time. And so you can see that there are different control tactics that like, hey, don't use a circuit if you don't need it. And this is a great example here. This design specifically I want to call out because I find it really fascinating, is if we go back and let's go look at this specific design. So for all designs, this one is the one that's the outlier. This is the one from Undertow that has a very high entity update time, but very low everything else. Entity time is going to be contributed also to like wake lists that are going to be active. There's always like a minimum amount of control behavior updates that are going to be there. So like you can see, this is a little bit higher than the baseline that has no circuits, but you're still going to always have it behind the scenes that is active, even if you have an empty world. So if you look at this design, and let's go look at basically what its like kind of waveform looks like. You can see that like it has almost no control up behavior update time, but then a lot higher volume of basically entities. And so if we compare that now against like this design from Lady Mayneth, you can see that like, okay, this is much smoother on average, but Lady Mayneth has large spikes. So does my design, which is the right now second place, and so does the design from Phlap. They all have these large spikes when things happen. And so what is interesting about this is this design fascinates me because when you look at it, like what it does really well is instead of having a lot of trade-off of circuit overhead, what it's doing is it is specifically just using wake lists for everything. So in theory, you could actually make this better because also like the ratios are really good. This is 11, just like the other one. So this is just barely over 120 per second. So, and the same thing is all using maximal direct insertion. Things are not over beaconed. This is like a pretty good design overall. And what I found so interesting is that it's belting all these materials. Now, one thing that I want to call out is that in the analysis that I did, it specifically called out stack inserters dropping to a belt. It did not call out picking up from a belt. So why is that? Now, this is not going to be the case for all designs, but I think it really comes into play here for chemical science, because chemical science has very low flow rate of things that are getting picked up off of a belt. So particularly here, if you look at this assembly machine, right, it only has like the rate that it's actually going to pull things out is very small. So per second, this basically stack inserter is going to only have to swing every 3 seconds here, every 2 seconds, like basically under 2 seconds it has to do it. So like the flow rate is low, and what it did really well is like, hey, for the higher volume item, I'm going to use the pipes. For the lower volume items, so things that are 5 or so below, just use a belt. And you can see how it fully stops moving whenever it pulls items off. So it's interacting with a non-moving belt. Another thing that it does really well is that it then direct inserts whenever it can, but still compromises and says, I'm always going to pick up from a non-moving belt here. So you can see that with all these designs as well, as you kind of go up, is that their interaction, when they pick something up, all the items that are always being picked up from a non-moving belt. And so the cost is really low here, it seems like. So let's go and actually compare that. If we look at the actual metrics for the stack inserters from a belt, let's look at if we can find a correlation that actually matters for that. So let's look up stack inserters from a belt. So it has a high impact, but it doesn't have, and let's filter specifically for the stack inserters from belt. It has a very small update. It seems like very small, like not even like a direct correlation with the entity update time. Where it does matter is the transport line update time. That's where it is the only high cost. So it seems like what's interesting is that the designs that did better, and that's what we're seeing here over back in Factorio, is that the cost of picking up from a belt is a lot less than dropping constantly to a belt. And that's actually interesting. Like I would like to maybe benchmark that in comparison, like compare one like in an isolated manner. But you're seeing here that kind of matters because the flow rate, and this is very dependent on the items that are getting pulled out, the flow rate of these items is very low. So they all can pick up always from a non-moving belt, and the cost isn't that high. And so you're seeing that just across the board. So there are designs that are lower, basically, that ranked lower, that were picking up from a moving belt. So the designs that are picking up pipes, for example. Or specifically, my baseline design is really bad in doing that because it's constantly picking up items from a moving belt like this, right? So, but it didn't overall contribute as much to the entity update time. What mattered more was the items that were dropping to it, because these are constantly active, constantly scanning, trying to drop as the stack inserter here. So it seems like that's what mattered more for this design, because like, especially, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself for the finals, but look at these top 3 designs. Look how wildly different they are. These both are direct insertion designs that are directly inserting into engines and going into basically the assembly machines that are crafting chemical science. My design doesn't do that at all and uses recipe switching here and sets filters and starts and stops the assembly machines whenever this belt backs up here. And then goes and produces and constantly has a non-moving belt that these sensors are picking up from. Same thing up here. And you can see too, like the common patterns, these are all picking up from belt. Also, real quick, Phlap, I'm gonna have a little rant session. Your design is the most cursed design of all time. Okay, at first when you look at this doesn't seem so bad. Then let's start looking a little bit closer. What are you doing? There's a legendary underground pipe going to an epic one. Then you have a legendary one going to a normal one, and then you have a rare, and then you have an epic to epic, and and then on top of that, like, this is so intentional. Look how symmetric this is. Like, you very intentionally did this. Like, why? This messed with my head so much when I first looked at this, and I was having such a hard time to even understand what the heck is going on. Like, let's say your design wins. What am I supposed to do? Do I have to now go into the upgrade planner if I want to put in my blueprint book and I want to go and basically just go and I have to go and upgrade everything in here to basically be all normal? And like, I know it doesn't matter. Obviously it doesn't matter. Your design is technically actually right now in the rankings 0.1% worse than my design. So they're basically equivalent, which is also wild that these are basically equivalent. Also, just fun fact, right now the difference in percentage between the top 3 designs in general, let's go to that summary. If we look at that, the top 3 designs at the moment is 0.5% difference between the top 3 designs. 0.5. Look how wildly different their designs are. I think it kind of goes to the point of what I'm trying to say, so it kind of leads nicely into it, other than my segue into the cursed nature of what Phlap did here, which I don't want to talk about again. But I probably will because it'll make it to the finals, so anyway. So the point of where I'm kind of going with this is that it seems like for these particular builds, what really mattered was moving from a non-moving belt, what you were doing with the items that were dropping to a belt, and also not having overly, like having too many beacons for things you didn't need, and then ultimately just minimizing the number of inserters that are constantly interacting with a moving belt. So next, I kind of want to go through now a comparison of like these top 7 designs. One of the things that I noticed here for like looking at, let's say Lady Manus was the first one that I wanted to kind of point out. I find it interesting that the only difference between these 2 designs was that it was a reduction in beacons. And by reducing the beacons, as we saw in the last episode, there is every 120 ticks, there's an entity update time that happens. And so by just reducing beacons around non-critical items that didn't need it, it dropped the entity update time from 806 to 795. That's the only difference. Sure, it's a 0.83% difference, but it's enough to basically secure right now and still her holding leading spot in the #1 position. So I thought that was already an interesting thing to right off the bat to say. The second thing that I want to call out is the difference between design 35 by Henry JK and my design. Both of them use recipe switching. So the 3 that are using recipe switching are the Geist used it, Henry JK, I'm using it, Jobo, and Phlap. And so let's compare those 3, or basically all those designs, and look at what happened. So one of the things that I'm going to point out right away by Henry JK is you see these huge control behavior update times. Like, we're talking way beyond even the scale of this particular graph. I clamped it at 3 milliseconds of update time. This goes way beyond that. And what are these spikes that are happening? So let's go and look at this design, and let's go and look at the design by Phlap, you see these large control entity update time spikes that happen. And if we zoom out a little bit further, I'll just go ahead and regenerate the charts to go to 480. So let's go and put 720 in there, and let's go and regenerate the charts. Okay, so with the charts regenerated, you see that there's these large waveforms that happen for Henry JK. This is around recipe switching that's happening. My design has also recipe switching, it just happens very infrequently, so there's large waves where it happens. So for my design, for example, you'll see there's over the 18,000 ticks, you'll see there's this larger wave when it's wind up generating the materials from recipe switching for engines. Same thing that kind of happens here, same thing that kind of happens here. It's all spread out. Phlap's design, if we look at basically the design 13, there's these large spikes that happen, and also entity update time or the control behavior update time that's happening very often. What are these spikes that are here? There's a similar thing that's happening here for this design. There's a similar design that happens for Jobo, where he has these large, you know, basically like control behavior update time. This is not insignificant, you know, this is well into almost the 3 millisecond mark, you know. So what are the commonality between these patterns that you see where those control behavior update time spikes are happening? Well, if we look at it when we're starting to compare recipe switching tech, which was, you know, obviously was used a lot, the way that I do it is I just wait until, and I use an RS latch for the pipes. So if they're less than 1,000, then I just generate them until they're 2,000. And then because of the ratios, gears are, you know, 512 to 1,000. So I just basically kept them so that they're smaller amounts. So that way then the chest is just monitored, and all the rest of them are also monitored to have a similar consistency in them. So there might be a little bit of an imbalance occasionally, but because of the timings of when they run, they will just consistently just turn on, turn off, and stop occasionally. So eventually these will fill up and get to the point, but the ratios will always be the same in these particular, basically in these designs here. You can see it's like a 2 to 1, 2 to 2. So eventually these will stop and they will just not doing anything. And that's just mainly because this one starts and stops occasionally. So it's stable, and like this particular sandbox world I've been running for probably like 72 hours of just like either talking through it and looking at it, so these designs are here. So one of the things that worked really well was like, okay, so that works well in like just latching on and off when they happen to be producing the materials, like you're seeing here, it's going through a cycle, and then that's where that larger wave would happen. When you go down to the next recipe switching tech, which was here by Henry JK, this one's really cool because it's direct insertion. So its entity time, update time, right, is significantly lower than mine is, because I don't have inserters that are active, you know, like I have them active for a longer period of time than his design is. And also but the main difference that you wind up seeing between those is his entity uptime happens to be lower because of direct insertion, but the overall circuit behavior update time is much higher. And the reason for that, and when you compare these, is you'll see that like here this is 187 versus 143 for my design. And so comparing them, what's going on? So what's going on is he's doing a really cool thing here, which is he's using 3 inserters to actually overload the amount of items well beyond the automated stack insertion limit, because all of them are running at once, all dumping into there. So they can actually well exceed the amount here from direct insertion. So that's actually an interesting thing, is you can bypass significantly the automated insertion limit by using more inserters, which I didn't know until watching this. But because it's switching so often in short succession, that's where those large spikes come from that you wind up seeing. That's that 1, 2, 3, right? When it's crafting engines. Now it doesn't happen too often because it can overload it, which is great. But switching recipes is very expensive on control behavior update time. And that was a thing that I noticed when I was designing or like doing benchmarks and tests, is that I noticed early on, like, hey, this setting recipes is expensive. So the next design that did recipe switching tech as we go down is both Geist and I did a good job of basically buffering the items in the chest. Now, I need to talk with Geist. This particular design, for some reason, has some kind of an imbalance after like 3-4 hours of running it. So I don't know exactly what's going on with that. It seems like it eventually runs out and it gets balanced, and then they basically stop producing engines and the output has a problem. I don't know what that is, so it's not going to impact the benchmarks right now, but there is an instability, and I do need to talk with him about it at some point. The point is, like, his also did like a buffering concept and would run the particular engine like switching tech until, you know, they got to the values that it needed to go to. So then when we see like the big drop off kind of comes from now, once we start looking at the other two designs that did recipe switching. Let's just go here to that. The other two that did it was Phlap's design and Jobo's design. So what I'm going to do for this next section is I'm going to talk about Undertow's, Phlap's, and Jobo's and talk about why they're similar in performance. And you can see like they have a large control update, entity update time versus Undertow's. But again, Undertow's we've talked about, that one has no control network, no clocking at all. So these three designs. So here's the one that has, you know, no clocking at all. This is very similar to this design and very similar to this design. The two things that these two designs are doing, basically by Phlap and by Jobo, is they're switching very frequently their recipes here. So let's go look at their waveform characteristics. So if we look at the design here by Phlap, you see that there's a lot of spikes for control behavior update times that are happening in here. And if you look at Jobo's as well, if I click that one up, you'll see the same thing, but very, very large spikes. One of the things that's different is because in Jobo's design, this is happening very frequently, that this recipe switching is happening, and it's just for just-in-time the values. For Phlap's design, it's very similar. However, the conditions are just different enough where the recipe switching isn't happening as often. And so he actually starts and stops these engines. And so you can see here, like, this is a direct insertion coming out and going into here. So this happens a lot more frequently that it's switching recipes because this is constantly running. Whereas these designs actually have a start and stop, so it's not as often that the recipe switching is going to happen. But that was like the big thing that I noticed is like, okay, the expensive part of recipe switching is actually setting it. And then additionally, the other thing that I would have done differently for Phlap's design is I probably would have just minimized the number of beacons that are here because of just how infrequently this is running. So that's kind of where you're seeing that these three, this has no circuits. This is using really heavy control behavior update times. And so these wind up having a very similar characteristic in performance, that the control behavior update time was basically ate up the cost that was saved by having less inserters compared to this one that had no clocking at all. So that's kind of some things that I noticed. A secondary thing that I start to notice as you kind of go beyond this design and start to get further down is you start to notice this pattern of having more assembly machines that are crafting electromagnetic plants. Now, it doesn't make that huge of a difference because you'll see this will tick-tock. Now we're having there's just more of them. We'll finally get back down to like having a 4 build, but then again, this one suffers because it winds up now double grabbing items from basically double swinging for the outputs. So you start to notice that, like, okay, the trade-offs start to go down. And so this one starts to perform worse, mainly because now we're belting a more expensive item, which is also pipes, right? Now, it's not always the case, but, like, again, the main thing is, again, just this condition hurt so much, right? We had a direct correlation of that. And similar things, or similar kind of concepts and patterns is that, okay, we have recipe switching here, and this one in particular has recipe switching and then basically goes into chests and unloads them like this. And then very similar to my design, but then ultimately I still also has an issue when from Geist here, where if you run it for 4 or 5 hours, it has this issue here where it just stops, and I don't know how to solve it. So, and then as you go, basically continue to kind of go down and look at these, they all kind of have similar characteristics where we're now belting 2 ingredients instead of just 1. And so then that becomes more costly, and now too many foundries, those kinds of things. And so just kind of as you continue to go down, now we have 3 of these when we could have had 2. The conditions here are greater than 7. You start to see these things start to compound those different decisions, right? So where the best designs ultimately landed were ones that, again, just kind of balanced overall, not using too many circuits, reducing recipe switching, reducing the items that are getting picked up from a belt, always interacting with a non-moving belt, and then, yeah, just finally just not having too many beacons, and reducing just the number of entities while keeping overall the control behavior update time kind of low. So just like all these different things that all came in combination made these 3 designs, although layout-wise very different, winds up making so that they're performing better. So it's always a balancing act, right? So that makes sense if that's the case. But in general, where I'm getting to is you start to see more compounding decisions that were not optimal that ultimately makes designs perform worse and worse as we go further down the list. So I think some things as well that work really well to kind of balance here is because the input rate of chemical science, right? Like the actual items that are being traveling across a belt are such low frequency. The designs that do a lot of, direct insertion here of assembly machine 3s, crafting engines, and then directly inserting them into assembly machines wind up not having as large of an impact as you would probably expect. And it's because of like the low time, right? Like if you look at this machine, it's going to only need them every 3 seconds. This is going to have to swing once to go and put something in there. So for that reason, like, you're not saving that much by direct inserting, and because it's not moving belt, that's not that big of a deal. So where I'm kind of getting at is like direct insertion is the most impactful when the flow rate is high. So this is really helpful, having extra, basically just running copper plates directly into here the advanced circuits because of just how much of a volume that is. So that all the designs that are in like the top positions all did that. That's where the direct, like, basically it helps a lot. So for chemical science specifically, I want to kind of like take this as an example and kind of break this out. So if you think about it in terms of this, and well, I'll move this over. Eventually we're going to get to, basically in this series, we're going to get to production science, which is a very different animal altogether. So let's talk about this real quick and compare the two here. So I'll just move this here, rotate, and flip. Nice. So move that over, move that over. What fundamentally worked really well for chemical science is it didn't seem to make a huge difference if you were belting these materials. Where it really mattered was just having direct insertion more for higher flow rate items, and since advanced circuits are so compressed, it seemed like this wound up being something that ultimately just belting those materials and very infrequently picking them up off of a non-moving belt made not that big of a difference. Once we go and get to actually making productivity packs, that's a whole different animal. We're going to have a huge flow rate of rails, right? So you're sticking around to this. Pro tip for sure. When we get to this science, definitely go and have your rails directly inserted. This is where it's going to actually matter. So doing this here, because of the high flow rate, and you're like, if you actually did max out this, you'd have to have 2. Or no, sorry, just 1. 1 would be enough. So doing this is going to matter way more when we get to productivity science because the flow rate's so high. But you can probably just belt the other material, and it's just not going to matter for that. So doing that is probably just as good, and it's probably going to hurt you more if you wind up going and directly inserting those. not that it's going to hurt, it's just you're going to trade off such a huge amount of beacons that you can actually place around the building, right? So that's where, like, there's a trade-off that you can still, like, just belting materials actually winds up being good if the flow rate is really low. So you gain more from direct insertion if you're constantly moving. So based on how frequently it's happening. So for chemical science, it seemed like the lesson here to kind of take away from this is belting is fine as long as you're doing really good clocking, and ultimately the insertion, like the flow rate is low that's going into that machine. So that was a good balance. Now, this leads me to kind of a second tangent. Why did so many designs, when we know that there is a very large correlation between picking these up, why did so many of them opt to basically go and enable things on a cadence of 8 rather than 16? Well, in the last episode, we talked a lot about automated insertion limits and why they are so hard to get right. And so what you wind up seeing is, I'll take my design as an example here. So in order to even get belting to work properly, I came up with a really complicated way of doing this, which is basically waiting, like, basically until the chests are filled, and this takes a while for this to happen. Okay, now you can go here to the second stage. You can now delete the startup circuits over here. And so why am I doing this? I'm waiting until green circuits back up so I can do it. I wait until all these chests are at a point where they have all their materials completely filled up. And then finally what I wind up doing is I wait here until this thing tells me, hey, the engine back pressure is reached and it's ready to prime. Pause this. And then what I wind up doing is I do a stage 3, which is I go and place this down. What this does is it now activates these clocks. And what it does is it fills up in the first 4 ticks, it puts sulfur at a stack size of 8. And you can see here that we're setting a stack size and we're setting actually the filters here. And so in very short succession, it puts all those items in exactly at the way that I want, and then it says, yay, priming sequence is complete. So a big difference is that now this is in a place where sulfur's at 6, advanced circuits are at 2, and engine units are at 0, and chemical science packs are at 8. So what does this do when I kick this off? So now what this guarantees is when I go to the final sequence, a big difference too is where these were setting filters before. That's the reason I'm using the 4th item is to change the logic here. So now it's just enable and disable. So it's no longer setting filters. So now, okay, cool. So it tells you can delete those circuits, and it does that. So there's an initial kind of stop, and then basically this happens. So why did I do that? Well, the reason is that this can tend to oscillate, like we talked in the last video, and that priming sequence that I generated is specifically for when you lose basically any like a specific material. You're going to run out of red circuits, you're going to see this kind of come in, and then this is all going to basically get drained. And then it's going to stop. So what does it actually stop at? So when it stops, for me, they're going to be at some ratio of 24, or they're going to be sometimes higher. So these happen to all perfectly synchronize because of the timing. But it can also stop at 20, or it could stop at 40. So it depends on like the timing of when these items are in here. But you're going to see that right now it's either at 4, 24, 40, or 20. Those are the different ratios. They'll never stop at 16 or 32, so they never get output block where it has to swing twice. If this is already confusing you, I'm sorry, it also really confused me. And so what kind of happens with this, if we go and add this back, is you're going to see that there's going to be a momentary kind of stop of basically of the output, as basically the red circuits finally come back in. They can pick up, and you can see this one misses a swing, right? And this one misses a swing. But eventually this always will deterministically recover. It takes a little bit for them all to lock back in, but they will get to a point where this will just constantly produce the materials again. So that happens because all the items in here, you can see this is 12, 4, 8, 8. 12, 4, 8, 8. And all the way down. These are all... Because what kind of happens is they will be either 4, they will be 8, but they will always be 12. And the main reason like this works is because this is tricking them into a combination it would never be in. What I hate about this is that this is so hard for me to explain and to debug and to explain to others how this works. And it really adds a lot of complexity to designs. So I talked to one of the developers from Factorio, and I was explaining kind of the issue with basically the overload insertion limit. In my opinion right now, the big reason that it has an issue is just because it doesn't take productivity into account. So if this would take productivity into account, then it should, in my opinion, double the automated insertion limit and all these problems would go away. Now, that's a simple approach. I would personally really like it if we could change the overload multiplier ourselves. I know you can do it in mods, but when we're playing, like basically if you're doing and you're comparing one megabase to another, we're usually doing it in vanilla with non-breaking mods. So in my opinion, I would like this to be modifiable because doing this with stack inserters is almost impossible. But why do we do it? Well, we already know from this video that the amount of times, like just changing this clocking ratio to be from greater than equal to 16 or greater than equal to 8, completely like directly impacts the entity update time because inserters are so expensive. So we want to use stack inserters because stack inserters can stack up to 16 and bulk inserters can only go to 12. So you're missing out on that extra optimization that's there. And it's not 1%, you know, it's more than that, as can be seen like just in the sheer drop off of the top 7 that are doing basically stack size 16 and the ones that are doing stack size or like picking up just even as an extra just 1 tick update where it's grabbing it. It's because of that extra scan that's happening. So I am currently in a place where in order right now to create an optimal build that can handle back pressure loss and all these different good things, you either have to go with a design that's doing direct insertion and really cleverly setting filters and being able to understand kind of the ratios, and this all works out because these will all get output blocked at 16, and that's 1-to-1 here is going to be fine for these designs. Same thing here, this one didn't suffer, 1-to-1, output blocked at 16, doesn't matter, it's going to still be able to insert it into that machine afterwards if it misses a swing. It was absolute nightmare to do it with belts. So, because they would just cause imbalances all the time. And finding the exact ratios, the exact numbers, the exact fill rate, what worked was, took 90% of the time of this actual build. So, or probably not 90%, but like the majority of the time. So what frustrates me is that I don't want to tell people, hey, you need to figure out this complexity. Because it's, if something is hard for me to explain, and it's hard for me to put into words how this mechanic works, it's going to be too advanced for almost every single Factorio player that's out there in the community. So if you get to that point where you have to go and design something in order for a build that's, in my mind, really cool, but in order for it to actually work and function, and you need to have 4 stages for it to actually fully function and work, and a full-on explanation, and probably someone has to watch my video on how this whole entire design works, you're getting to the point where it's too complex for every single person that's out there, and it kind of, it's not even a quality of life problem, it becomes more of a, like, it's a mechanic that I think is kind of broken. So these buildings are super great, like it's great that we have a quality mechanic. What I don't like is the fact that because automated insertion limits always block you, you can't do traditional clocking, and you'd have to go back to bulk inserters. Well, we don't want to do that. So how do you get around it? So there's solutions. And right now, if you're in this competition, like this is the kind of stuff you have to do. And this is probably going to really plague people when they get to military science because the ratio's there, and it's going to even worse plague us in like utility science. So just forewarning that that's going to be an issue. So anyway, those are my thoughts on it. I know that I might sound like a kind of like a grumpy old man about it, and I know that this is like for not everyone megabases anyway, so like why is this a big deal? I just think like automated insertion limits are great. They're really good for like early game mechanics. They do nothing for late game. They have no real benefit for us. So having an ability to modify it, not using mods, and doing something that at least takes productivity into account, because we never had that before in 1.0, that you can go double the amount of productivity. You know, like at max, we would get basically a 40% productivity bonus. And so, because the original like mechanics were all based around a yellow inserter's swing time, you know, like we have machines that are and like can transport significantly more items per second than basically the standard yellow belt was. So, I think, in my opinion, this should be modified. I'd love to see this in 2.1. But as of right now, for people that are doing mega basing in 2.0, we got to deal with it. We got to find a way to get around it. So. Okay, so that is my overall analysis of the correlations that I found interesting, what actually was impacting these designs the most. So, at this point, where are we going from here? So, the top 7 designs are going to make it into the finals. At for sure. I'd also like to, I may include some of these other designs here as well, specifically Undertow, because I find that interesting. So we'll expand it to the top 8 designs are going to basically be included. So that means that the variance right now between these top 8 designs is only a 8% delta. So those will run for a much longer period of time. As I said, I will have to get back with some of the designers to fix some of their longer term issues, like with some of the designs, just in case they want to. But they don't seem to have an issue for the 1 hour mark, so I'm not concerned about that. Now, what I'm going to do, because we spent so much time in this episode talking through what actually was good, even in the top designs, that that is going to give me a lot more time now for the finals to do something that I've been wanting to do for a while, but I haven't yet. So what I want to do is, because design 18 from Lady Mayneth, my design, and Phlap all have really good concepts that are different fundamentally, I'd like to see if we can create a hybrid approach that takes some of the core concepts that made each of these really good and see if we can make something that's better. The other thing that I want to do is I'd like to do some isolated testing. So specifically what I'd like to do for this is I'd like to be able to go and say, hey, was this red circuit design better objectively than this one? Or this one? And benchmark those in isolation and do more component testing. And without any of the other input materials or raw input materials, just like basically straight up testing one versus the other. I think that'll be a really interesting thing to see. And then seeing if basically from all those tests, if we can create an overall design that's going to be better than the ones that we saw that are here. And we can create an even better one from all the lessons that were learned, the correlations that we found, and seeing if I can take all that knowledge and put it to the test and then create a summary on that. That's what the finals are going to be. I don't imagine that running this for 108,000 ticks is going to make any difference compared to the 36,000 that we did. I think that you might see, again, just kind of like a swap between these two different designs or like that, but I think Lady Mayneth is still going to hold that position. So that's what I'm predicting is going to happen. So that's it, but that's where I find it will be more interesting for us in the finals, is if I include a couple hybrid designs that I benchmark alongside these to see if that winds up being taking and changing their positions overall, along with some isolated benchmarks for their components. So that's my plan. That's what I'm going to do for the finals, and that's what we'll see. And then we'll basically the designs that are all within 1% of each other are all going to be included in my publicly available blueprints on GitHub, and you'll be able to see that. Unlike former videos, I normally write a large kind of README on all these. For this one, I will do it, but I will do it probably sometime this next week after I've published the video and have it out there. So then I can kind of formulate my thoughts. It's going to take me a little bit to take all those correlations and take them out of the video format and put them kind of in a digestible version as a README. But I still want to always include a readable version of these videos because I would like to be able to refer back to them and have them for documentation purposes. So if you stuck around in the video until this point, you're a wonderful person. Thank you for the attention span. Thank you for listening to me talk this whole amount of time. If you want to support this kind of content, the best thing you can do is just give the video a like, comment if what you find interesting, and subscribe if you think that I've earned your subscription. Otherwise, if you want to talk more or you want to join these kind of competitions, we're going to be moving on to the next science here relatively soon. We're probably changing the format a little bit, but that's going to be the next plan. And if you want to do that, come join the Discord and come hang out and talk with the rest of the people that are designing builds like this. Thank you again to every single person that is on this list here. The amount of information and the amount of correlations that we could do because of the volume of designs is a really unique opportunity that I wouldn't be able to do without all the wonderful people that have designed them. So just thank you so much for participating and joining the competition and being okay with not being the #1 design or vice versa. And so that we can all benefit from learning from what works and what doesn't work. All that being said, thank you so much for watching. That's the plans. I'll see you in the next episode.